Hello everyone, and welcome back to the fanfic reread project. Today we are beginning our reread of the first of my old Batman fanfics, Batman Begins. Now, I don't think this one really needs all that much preamble. It's a fanfic of Batman Begins. It's literally a retelling of Batman Begins. So what I can say about it is that this was written between the tail end of 2012 and the first few months of 2013. It took me a while to write this story. I'm not entirely sure why, but it just did. I finished it in March, I think, or April. Something like that. I just know that it's remarkable because this story is 30,000 something words and it took me that many months to write it. But then the next Batman fanfic that I wrote is twice that size, or was at the time, and took me a month and a half. So this was the first fanfic that I wrote that I actually finished. As I probably mentioned during the reread of my first Hunger Games fanfic, I never finished that. I never got around to it after Nano. I kind of just dropped it. But this one I actually saw it all the way through to the end. It has been edited at later dates, but not a lot. It's kind of hard to explain, but I think the last time I edited this was maybe early 2014, and it really doesn't look that different than it did back in 2013. So this is as close to the original actual text that we're gonna get. I think that this story and its two sequels are probably the most peak 2013 stuff that we're gonna read. But let's jump into it. By the way, these chapters aren't numbered and I am not going to try to number them because the last time I tried to do that, I lost count. It is a very easy thing to do when you have to cut these up into separate episodes instead of reading it all the way through. But I'll say which character is the POV as we're going through it. So we're starting on a Bruce chapter. I think the first 9 chapters are all Bruce chapters, so. Rachel, let me see. Her head peeked out from between the stalks of the tall sunflowers that lined his mother's flower garden. As soon as he laid eyes on her, she disappeared again. The colorful blooms turned to a rainbow-colored mush as he followed her giggles through the flower beds, only stopping at the sound of the greenhouse door squeaking shut. He'd always thought the greenhouse looked like a jungle, with the way the trestles hung heavily over the sides of the tables like large vines, and it felt like it too. The glass walls amplified the heat, and the plants made it humid. There was no sign of her, though, as he scanned the quiet spot. Maybe she had left? He started towards the door as well, but then he felt himself being pulled down. All right, let's stop right there. Number 1, I think these 2 paragraphs are actually kind of emblematic of some of the problems that this story has, which is weird because it's literally 2 paragraphs. But number 1, repetition, unnecessary repetition. Colorful blooms turned to a rainbow-colored mush. You could have said that differently. Number 2, in the second paragraph, run-on sentences. This story is especially bad about them. I don't know what was going on with me back in 2013, but I just had so much trouble just ending sentences, or better yet, just separating them into different sentences and different thoughts. So from here on out, one thing that I kind of don't like to constantly do is point out mistakes like that in the writing. So I'll try not to mention it unless it really makes it hard for me to read. So in that case, we might mention the run-on sentences a bit more than the repetition, but yeah, let's keep going. Rachel was crouched under the nearest table, parting the vines with the hand she didn't have around his wrist. He crawled under and kneeled down next to her, staining the skirt of his new dress. "Can I see?" he asked, starting to pry open her hand. She slapped him away. "Finders keepers, I found it." "In my garden," he reminded her. She narrowed her eyes at him over the thick black frames of her cat-eyed glasses, but she gave in and dropped the thing into his hands. It was a rock, smooth gray, with a point at... Oh, okay, there's a typo there. That's why I keep getting mixed up. It was a rock, smooth gray, with a point at one end that left little red pinpricks in his palms. It was an arrowhead. He'd never seen one in person before. She started to take it back from him, but he shot out from under the table and bolted to the back door. "Finders keepers!" In the thing where it's Rachel was crouched under the nearest table, this always gets me. Parting the vines with the hand she didn't have around his wrist is such a long way to say parting the vines with her other hand. And this is something that I've noticed in quite a few of my old stories, but especially this one, where I don't know if it's just that I didn't have the words to say certain things, or I just didn't know how to convey it concisely. So I'll have these really long, overwrought sentences to say something that is fairly simple and could be conveyed with a lot less words. I think we'll be seeing more of that throughout this. So when it comes up again, you know what happened. The back parts of the manor's extensive lawns were not as well manicured as the ones in front of the greenhouse. Here the grass was a little bit longer and the plants a little more unruly. His eyes landed on the crumbling walls of the disused well, half hidden behind a patch of scraggly shrubs. It would be a perfect place to hide. The sun-bleached boards covering the well's mouth gave a distressing groan as he ducked behind the wall, but he ignored it, instead focusing on the unmistakable creak of the greenhouse door opening again. He peeked over the edge, his hands picking up the dust of old mortar and staining white. Rachel was still standing in front of the greenhouse's back door, her pigtails swinging as she looked left and right trying to find him. She pushed her glasses up on her nose and then looked right in his direction. He ducked back down quickly, and the board splintered softly beneath him. He could hear her as she made her way through the dry grass, no doubt following the same trail his feet had made not even a minute before. He started to inch backwards, hoping to make it through the gap in the wall without her hearing, but the creaking boards underneath him grew louder the more he moved. He decided to just make a run for it, but when he stood, there was a violent crack beneath him and he felt himself being pulled down. Okay, this is not a funny moment, but I just had the mental image of Bruce standing up and then like all the stuff disappearing beneath him and him looking down and then falling like he's in a cartoon, because the way that was described really made me think of that. That's never happened before. But let's keep going because we're almost at the end. He landed hard on his stomach, and the rocks scraped painfully at his arms and legs. The sunlight blinded him as he looked up at the sound of his name echoing down the cobblestone wall. He tried to respond, but he lost his breath, and his throat ached when he rasped out her name. Her voice became distant after that, slowly disappearing as she called out for her mother. As the sunlight pierced the cool, damp space, the air slowly became tepid, and his breast felt labored in the deep humidity. He turned himself over, and a terrible pain shot through his right arm. He stared right into a hole, a dark thing whose mouth was lined with sharp and jagged rocks that looked like they'd eaten right into the cobble surrounding it. All manner of sounds echoed out of it, from the distant drip of water to squeaking and the not-so-distant flutter of wings. And that's the end of that chapter. Yeah, we got to that really quickly. That's good, because I meant to read like 3 chapters in this episode. This opening it does what it needs to do. I said that a lot during the Prof's reread, but I feel like that's something that you're going to hear a lot during this. I think this is the first time, well, no, that's not true, because there was a Bran chapter in the other one that I actually really liked. But 9 times out of 10 in these old stories, like, the chapters are passable. I don't think there are any that are, like, outright, like, terrible. But most of them are good enough that you can get through them. They tell you what they need to tell you, and that's kind of it. There's never, like, super, super good ones. That might change when we get to The Dark Knight Rises, but we'll see what this story has in store for us later down the line. Overall, though, this chapter, I just couldn't stop thinking about the ways that you could change the sentence construction throughout this and make it read better. Just like some of the Prof stuff that we read in Prof's 1.0. This story, or this chapter in particular, it might apply to the other ones, it might not. It has an over-reliance on the word the, and there are multiple times where I could see that word being kicked out of the sentence and it not affecting anything and it actually reading better. And then there are just other times where I could feel a good moment happening, but the description of the moment kind of fucks it up. Like when Bruce is in the hole and it describes the air around him becoming more like humid and says it's like tepid. That's a nice moment that I think really can convey the discomfort of the situation, even beyond the fact that his arm is hurting because he did something to it. But the way that it's written, it does not work. And that's something that I felt multiple times reading this, but yeah, overall it's fine. It doesn't offend me. So let's move on to the next chapter, which is again another Bruce chapter. The first 9 chapters I can keep track of, so I can number these, but once we get into the back quote-unquote half, or the back 2/3 of the story, that's when it starts to get really complicated. But let's move on to chapter 2 for now. Bruce's eyes snapped open just as the well began to overflow with bats. Instead of a sea of flapping wings and loud shrieks, he was met by an aged basalt ceiling and the stagnant air of a prison cell. In a morbid sort of way, he was grateful, but only just so. He'd been haunted by every twisted incarnation of that same dream for the last 20 or so years, and over time he became thankful for something as ordinary as wakefulness. That's definitely upsetting. Let's keep going. He hadn't been there. Okay, so this is an issue that I have with some old stories, but this one in particular, where the story will very suddenly change tense when it's referring to a place. So, like, here it says he hadn't been here long, but it felt like he had, when it's written in third person, so it should say there. It's very weird because it suddenly makes it feel like it's being written in present tense and not like past tense in third person. I can't remember my exact thought process, but I think I just thought like it made sense because we're in the character's head for them to say here instead of there. I don't know if I'd say grammatically, but it kind of doesn't make sense. But moving on. He hadn't been there long, but it felt like he had. His dark curls had grown long and heavy with oil, his skin was cracked and dry, and he had a beard now which was throwing him off a little bit. He rose from his cot slowly, but his joints still creaked slightly. He rubbed at a sore spot on the back of his neck with a cringe. He'd slept on floors more comfortable than this. I will always be confused about the part where it says that Bruce had a beard, because as far as I can remember, and this might have been a new thing because Bruce, the character as he existed in this and in this universe and the later versions of this universe, did exist past this story. So he developed as a character past this story. So there are certain details about like not only his character but his appearance that existed later but aren't really in evidence here. And the fact that Bruce can grow a beard is definitely one of them, because it fucking throws me off and I'm just like, how? You can't, that's not how that works. Anyway, I find it kind of weird that they don't let him like wash his hair. Is that not, just wash your hair? Anyway, moving on. Was it a dream? He jumped at the sound of his cellmate's voice, so wrapped up in his own thoughts that he'd forgotten he was there. It was a nightmare, he answered back in rough Mandarin. He never did quite catch the hang of it. Worse than this, he asked, indicating the cell around them, he being the cellmate. This, Bruce said, getting to his feet as the guard opened the barred door. This is the dream. Sexy. They filed through the dank hallways and out into the bleak courtyard. The clouds blanketing the sky were the same slate gray as the cracked pavement beneath them. The grass in the small field beyond it was sparse and faded. Other prisoners milled about the yard, looking sullen or angry or at something otherwise as unpleasant. Bruce didn't miss the ones that eyed him as he made his way through the food line. "They're going to fight you," his cellmate said over his shoulder. Bruce looked them over. The faces were more familiar than he was expecting. "Again?" "Until they kill you," he answered back with a sardonic chuckle. Bruce rolled his eyes as he watched the cook dribble gruel into his plate. "Can't they kill me before breakfast?" As soon as he turned around, his plate was knocked from his hands and splattered on the ground. The man standing in front of him was huge and covered with tattoos. He narrowed his dark eyes and punched Bruce right in the jaw. "You are in hell, little man," he said as Bruce stumbled and fell to the ground, "and I am the devil." He resisted the urge to roll his eyes again and got back to his feet, dusting the dirt from his pants. "You're not the devil," he scoffed. The man started to swing at him again, but Bruce caught his fist and kicked him hard in the knee. He watched with satisfaction as he fell to the ground. "Your practice." He guessed the sight of their leader being brought down so easily made them mad, because the rest of his cronies rushed him then. They turned out to be nothing more than street fighters, really. He'd learned that, while a man with informal training could be dangerous, one who doesn't use it properly is barely a threat. Most of them went as easily as the first, with the shove of a knee or a twist of the elbow. At least one of them was smart enough not to just throw himself at him, and he was almost glad for the challenge. So let me pause right here, because this is a paragraph that I kind of like to highlight. Because the fight scene, where is it? And what this is me attempting to get around actually writing out a fight scene, because back in the day, I was not confident in my ability to do so. So I would try to literally write around them by narrating a few like different moves and then having the character think on like what's actually happening in the fight. If you want an example of this that I think works a lot better, read Curse of the Black Pearl, chapter 3, Will's first chapter. His fight with Jack has the same thing happening, but instead of skipping the entire fight with a few sentences being like, "Oh, well, a man with training," you can clearly see where he and Jack trade a few jabs, and then Will stop and think about Jack's like technical ability and his own strategy, and then they trade a few jabs, and then it keeps going back and forth. So you get the sense that a fight is actually happening instead of it being like, "Oh, they're all coming at me, now let's just stop and not tell you anything that happens," and then suddenly the fight's over. Wow, looks like I didn't write an entire fight. It is worth noting that the Pirates of the Caribbean version with the similar tactics was written later than this, and also that story went through a pretty heavy editing process a few years after that. But still, the point stands, if you're going to do that in a fight scene, then you do have to balance between the commentary and the actual fighting. You can't just have one or the other, or else it feels like, well, I mean, with a fight scene, you could technically just have the other, but if I'm that not confident in my abilities to do it, then you have to have that balance, you know? But let's keep going. The guards started to move in when they went tumbling across the yard, and Bruce smashed the guy's head into a rock. "Solitary," one of them yelled as they forced them apart. "Why?" Bruce yelled back, honestly surprised. "Protection," the guard spat at him. "I don't need protection." He let out a stressed sigh as the others dragged Bruce back inside. "Not for you, for them." Okay, not to immediately stop again, but this character, literally, the guards moved in as he smashed the guy's head into a rock, and then has the nerve to be surprised when they say they're putting him in solitary confinement. You just smashed a guy's head into a rock. Like, are you kidding me? The one thing about reading this story is that I am living in the very far future. When we go through this, like, after this, go read Speak of the Devil. And see the very like big difference in the way that Bruce is written versus Daredevil, because it is kind of like amazing. And I do want to say that this is not a case of a certain character having like limits that another character doesn't, because that wouldn't like matter. I mean, like, this is the shit that I thought it was okay. And it's like, yeah, it's okay if Batman's super violent, that's cool. Just read Speak of the Devil, particularly episode 2. Good God, this is nuts. But let's keep going. The cell they tossed him into was cold and dark, and the slam of the door echoed over the dark stone walls. Gray light pushed through the dirty glass of the few small windows near the low ceiling in tiny shafts. He moved to the cot in the back, and even under the window he was swallowed by shadows. A cut on his hand stung as he wiped the sweat from his brow. This is another paragraph that's really good at showing the overuse of the word "the." "Are you so desperate to fight criminals that you'd lock yourself in to take them on one at a time?" Bruce jerked his head up at the wall across from him. He didn't remember anyone being in here. When he squinted, he could make out the vague shape of a man against the farthest wall. It wasn't one of the guards, however. The accent was European, or at least he thought it might have been. He hesitated before he responded with, "There were 7 of them, actually. I counted 6, Mr. Wayne." Bruce staggered internally. "How do you know my name?" "The world is too small for someone like Bruce Wayne to disappear, no matter how deep he chooses to sink," the voice said, and then he revealed himself. He was tall and amber skin, with black hair that was streaked lightly with gray, dressed in a suit that looked far too fine against the old stone walls, and leaning on a cane made of ebony with a silver handle. Something in his intense blue eyes put Bruce on edge. That description did not have to be all one sentence. Anyway. "Who are you?" he asked cautiously. "My name is merely Ducard, but I speak for Ra's al Ghul, a man who can offer a path." I'm going to pronounce Ra's al Ghul the way they do in the movie because my brain defaults to that, but just know that that's not necessarily how you are supposed to say that. Bruce raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think I need a path?" he said, tilting his head slightly. "Someone like you is only here by choice," Ducard answered with a sly smile. "You've been exploring the criminal fraternity." He paused and looked Bruce up and down, "But whatever your original intentions, you've become truly lost." Bruce grimaced. How would he know? "What does Ra's al Ghul offer?" he humored. "The path of one who shares his hatred of evil and wishes to serve true justice. The path of the League of Shadows." Bruce let out a small sigh. "You're vigilantes," he said dismissively. Ducard responded before he'd even finished the word. "A vigilante is just a man lost in the scramble for his own gratification. He can be destroyed or locked up." The last few words came a bit pointedly, and Bruce broke his gaze. "However, if you make yourself more than a man, they cannot stop you, and then you become something else entirely." "Which is?" Bruce asked, raising his brows. "A legend, Mr. Wayne." Ducard moved towards the door. "Tomorrow you will be released. If you're bored of brawling with thieves and want to achieve something, there is a rare flower that grows on the eastern slopes, a blue poppy. Pick one of those, and if you can carry it to the top of the mountain, you may find what you were looking for in the first place." The door to the cell opened as soon as he touched it. Bruce stared at his back as he left, feeling dazed and a bit overwhelmed. "What was I looking for in the first place?" he muttered to himself. Ducard turned back, his eyes glowing in the low light. Only you can know that. And that is the end of that chapter. So, before we talk about it overall, I do want to highlight a particular exchange, which is the part where Bruce says they're vigilantes and then Ducard supposedly responds before he finishes the word. Instead of saying Ducard responds before he could finish the word, it makes more sense to just have Bruce's line be cut off. Even if it's like a fake cutoff where you just put like an N or M, I'm not sure which dash you use for this, but you put a dash at the end of the word vigilantes and then drop the dialogue tag there and have Ducard's line come in like immediately after that without the description. That's an easy way to show exactly what I described here, because when you do it like this, like you don't convey what's actually happening. It's basically just like show, don't tell, you know? And even though this is a like medium where you are reading, so you are essentially telling everything, there are still ways that you can use the text to convey the things that are actually happening without just straight up telling people what's happening. You know what I mean? But I've always found that it's much more useful to have the dialogue do the thing that you want it to do instead of telling people what the dialogue is supposed to be doing, you know? Overall, this chapter was I don't have really any feelings for or against it. It's fine. For, again, what it is. It kind of does its job. This is an observation that I kind of never had before, though, is that for some reason the writing in this feels a bit juvenile. That is a weird thing to say, and I don't think it's necessarily true, so my brain is probably just trying to process the feeling. But this does feel like a story that is written by someone who is very young. Not like super young, not like a 10-year-old, but like someone who is slightly young trying to write about like 30-year-olds. To be fair, in 2013, I was a sexy 21. And these characters are all older than me, so there is that vibe, but 21 is not like terribly, I mean, I'm 27 now, and this is 2019, so it feels like this was forever ago, and I probably have matured since then, definitely as a writer, but also as a person. So that might be what it is. It's just me reflecting back on like my younger self, like, what are you doing? But I don't know, I feel like I get this vibe that like Bruce is a character who is supposed to be in his late 20s, at literally turning 30 over the course of this story. But some of his inner monologue and stuff reads like something from someone who is a lot younger and more petulant. Does that make sense? Like, I think it's a little commentary of like, how does he know, and that kind of stuff. But I guess let's follow the thread and see if this is a thing throughout the story. So chapter 3. They came to his cell in the morning, threw him in the back of a truck, and shoved him out on a dirt road that ran through the foothills. Now that's a long sentence I can get behind. He had to cough up all the dust out of his lungs before he could get to his feet. Shrubs covered the fields on both sides of the road, red blossoms on some, all blanched in the sunlight. His only guides were the mountains, which stood like shadowy giants in the distance. He followed the road until the shrub fields were behind him and a small hill rose above him. He scaled it with ease, despite the fact that he hadn't eaten a proper meal that morning. That's a detail that always bothers me, because, like, why did they not feed him? He's gonna climb a mountain. Okay, whatever. Another field spread out below him, painted in swaths of pink and purple and red and white. He'd never seen so many flowers before in his life, and he couldn't help the gasps that escaped him. The flowers would be here for sure, he thought. There was no other place. He waded right into the sea of blossoms as they waved gently in the breeze. There were so many of them, he thought, but none of them seemed to be blue. He spent a good portion of the day wandering through the fields looking for the poppies until he found a small patch of them poking out of the ground where a glacier had stripped away the grass. He looked up at the imposing mountains above him. He wasn't sure he'd even make it up the slopes at this point, but he picked one, stuck it in the buttonhole of his jacket, and made his way back to the road, determined to, at the very least, try. Some of these flowers had to be edible anyway. As he traveled, the colors became more muted. The bright blooms of the flowers began to disappear, replaced with dark green grasses, and then fading into achromatic browns. The road started to become rockier as the altitude increased and the air cooled. He was lucky to come across a small stream, and he drank happily. Eventually, the road led him right into a small village. The street was virtually empty, save for a few people who didn't even give him a second glance. That's interesting. Do they get visitors on their mountainside very often? He stopped when he heard a tiny voice sound from behind him and turned to find a child standing there, small and dark-eyed in an almost threadbare tunic. They pointed to the flower on his chest, but he didn't understand the words they were saying. An old man appeared at their side, took them by the shoulder, and led them inside a house. "I need food," Bruce ventured. He turned around and eyed the flower as well. "Turn back," he said, and then he shut the door. The encounter should have given him reason for pause, but he'd come so far that he had no choice but to continue on his way. The last few paragraphs we read definitely have instances of sentences that are unnecessarily long or just have words that don't need to be there. This is really small, but the road started to become rockier. Just say the road became rockier, you know? Beyond the village, the path really began to incline. Plants began to disappear altogether, and the few that remained were scrubby shrubs. Plants disappeared. Just... He passed small shrines and stupas with their multicolored flags waving in the cold winds. Slowly, the path vanished into the rocky ground, and small towers of rounded stones marked the rest of the way. He pulled his scarves and coat against freezing winds that whipped tiny snowflakes into cyclones that swirled across the dark rocks beneath him. His hands became raw as he climbed over icy cold ledges. He kept his eyes down, away from the burning cold, but suddenly jerked his gaze up when the ground leveled. Why isn't he wearing gloves? Is he wearing gloves? Oh, God. Up a flight of stout stone stairs, a pair of massive wooden doors stood in a dark and vaguely foreboding monastery, lit by a pair of small lanterns made of rusting copper. A thin layer of ice had frozen into the grooves of the wood and made it appear glossy in the dimming light. He pounded weakly against the door, but he wasn't sure anyone had heard. He raised his hand to knock again when the door started to open. Copper doesn't rust. I guess the rusting in the general sense is oxidizing doesn't really roll off the tongue, that word. I'm sure there's a word for what copper does, but that's kind of a small detail anyway. He entered a hall paneled in dark and polished wood, lit by rows of candles on the windowsills that melted together in the misshapen mounds of wax. Lanterns hung from the walls, but they remained unlit. An elaborately gilded throne sat in a shallow alcove, silhouetted by the gray-blue light streaming through the window behind it. Bruce couldn't gather the energy to be startled by the doors suddenly shutting behind him as he ventured inward. Dark figures emerged from the shadows and surrounded him, poised to attack. His weary body tensed. Wait. The voice traveled from behind, and Bruce turned to find Ducard leaning against a pillar. Another voice reached his ears, an old voice that came from that throne. Ducard didn't hesitate to begin translating, as if he knew Bruce wouldn't understand. What are you seeking? His voice shook as he spoke. I seek the means to fight injustice, to turn fear against those who prey on the fearful. He removed the flower from his coat with a trembling hand and held it out to him. Ducard took it and examined the rich blue blossom before putting it in his own buttonhole. To manipulate the fears of others, you must first master your own, he translated again, but then continued on in his own words. Are you ready to begin? Bruce was bewildered at the question. He began to protest, but Ducard kicked him to the ground. Death does not wait for you to be ready, he growled. Bruce rose, and Ducard sent his heel right into his ribs. Death is not considerate or fair, and, make no mistake, he switched to Mandarin then, here you face death. Ducard sent a roundhouse kick right towards Bruce's neck, but Bruce moved his forearm up just in time and blocked it. He took up a fighting stance. He hadn't climbed up the side of this mountain to get beaten to a bloody pulp. When Ducard struck him again, he was ready, and parried all of his hits, though without the ease of movement he had in the jail or any time before. Ducard did seem impressed, nonetheless. Tiger grain, jujitsu? You're skilled, no doubt, but this is not a dance, Mr. Wayne. Bruce felt an elbow smash into the side of his face and a kick to his groin, and then he was on the ground again. You are afraid, but not of me. Ducard crouched down by his side and met Bruce's gaze. Tell us, Mr. Wayne, what do you fear? So, this chapter, that is the end of the chapter, by the way. It's not this... I can't say definitively that it's better than the other ones, but I will say that I like pieces of this more. And I think the reason why is that this is the most vividly descriptive chapter that we've read so far. There are a lot of really nice little details that paint the image of what we're seeing here, and a lot of sensory details that we don't really see in the other chapters. You really get a feeling for how cold it is, or the bursting of the colors from the monochromatic scenery that we see in the mountains. It's nice. Those bits are nice. However, I feel like this could have been written a lot better and it would have only enhanced what we're seeing here, you know? So that's my overall. My last specific comment about this chapter, and it's actually one that I can apply to all the chapters we read so far, is that I feel like this story lampshades too many things too often. For those of you who do not know, because I don't think I've ever described this, lampshading is basically when the author deliberately references something that is happening in the book instead of the people kind of experiencing it in real time. So when I say lampshading, I'm talking about the fact that when Bruce is talking about Ducard beginning to translate Ra's al Ghul's words, it's Ducard didn't hesitate to begin translating as if he knew Bruce wouldn't understand. And there are other comments like that, specifically like last chapter, there were quite a few of those when he was talking to Ducard. I feel like that kind of stuff undermines the actual mysteries in the story. And I will note that this is different than clumsy foreshadowing, because you could see it as that too, but it's not. This is me specifically like having the inner monologue be like, hey, isn't it weird that he's doing this, instead of it just like being a hint at the fact that something strange is going on. That's the big difference here. And again, like I said, I feel like that kind of undermines the sense of mystery, because if you constantly lampshade the fact that something weird is going on, the fact that something weird is going on is no longer shocking or surprising when it's revealed in truth. And I feel like that ruins the mystique. So, and we'll see more of this throughout this story, but there are multiple points like that where Bruce's inner monologue is just like, oh my god, how did he know this thing that I never mentioned? And it's like, just shut the fuck up. It's kind of like you don't trust the audience to actually realize that something weird is going on, so you feel the need to tell them constantly, and that's never good, you know? I'm debating on reading the next chapter because it's very long. Okay, we're gonna go for it. So this episode might run a little long just because I do think it makes sense to cluster it with these first 3 chapters that we read, because the next 3 kind of go together on their own. So let's move on to chapter 4. Bruce lay at the bottom of the well, curled tightly into a ball. He didn't know whether they came because of the bats or if they were still from the horrible pain in his arm, but the tears poured down his face now. Oh, good God. That's a horrible sentence. Also, again, note the before tears. That doesn't need to be there. He was too distressed to try and move when someone called his name, or even when arms wrapped around him and lifted him from the floor. He pressed his face into soft cotton that smelled strongly of cleaning fluids and cologne. It almost hurt to keep his eyes open as he was lifted out of the dimness and back into the light, and he closed his eyes tight against the blazing sun. Once he was still again, he looked up to see his father, sun glinting off of the thin gold frames of his glasses, with their butler Alfred standing next to him, coiling a large rope around his arm. His long, lean face was filled with worry. "Are you okay, Bruce?" he asked. "Did you hurt anything?" Bruce didn't answer. Instead, he buried his face into his father's shoulder once more. Thomas whistled. "We're going back to the house now, okay, honey?" he told him as he got to his feet. "You're going to be okay." His father rubbed his back as they made their way back up the lawns, a gesture that usually brought him comfort, but now it did nothing to stop the shaking. He wanted so badly for it to stop, even if only to make his father stop worrying about him. He hated to make his parents worry. He shifted and tried to hug his father, but he'd completely forgotten about the pain in his arm and whimpered when it shot through him again. "There it is," Thomas said, shifting him to his other arm. He touched Bruce's elbow gingerly, and he whimpered again in response. "Will we be needing an ambulance, Master Wayne?" Alfred said as he adjusted his glasses. Thomas shook his head. "I'll set the bone and then take him in for x-rays later." "Very good, sir." Mrs. Dawes stood on the steps leading to the house, comforting Rachel, who had removed her glasses to wipe the tears from her eyes. She stood as the trio approached. "Mr. Wayne, I'm so sorry, sir. I've told her—" "Don't worry. It's fine," he responded quietly. She nodded and let out a small sigh. I know Mrs. Dawes was not there, but this had nothing to do with Rachel. It had very little to do with Rachel. Anyway, Bruce finally remembered the arrowhead in his hand and was surprised he hadn't let it go when he'd fallen. He held it out to Rachel as they passed, and she took it, mouthing a thank you as she rubbed at her eye. I don't know why I randomly was like, what would this story have been like if he did drop it down there and then didn't find it until he became Batman again? It would have been an interesting change of events, but anyway. The sun made the white marble floors of the sitting room glow as they reflected the blue of the sky, and the soft orange walls almost appeared gold. The room was filled with furniture in soft shades of white and brown and orange with bronze accents. Vases of white lilacs covered every surface. Despite the warm tones, Bruce shivered in the air-conditioned room, and he felt his father begin to walk faster. "Let's get you upstairs," he murmured. Alfred gave them a nod and left them for the kitchen. So I think this is a good time to mention the color coding in the story. So throughout this, as well as The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, you will see there are very specific places with very specific color schemes. Wayne Manor is almost always kind of dressed up in very warm tones of like oranges and golds, yellows, browns, and like creams and whites. While there are, as we'll see later in the story, a lot of other places that are owned by rich people tend to be done in shades of silver and white, and that is sort of meant to represent how the Waynes are sort of like actual like good people, while many of the other rich people in Gotham are a lot more shallow. I don't know how I feel about this anymore, but the fact that it exists is notable because this is kind of the first time I had ever tried to do something like that with color symbolism. Yeah, there's a little bit more with like black and gold in particular with regards to Bruce, but we will get to talk about that more the deeper we get into this series as a whole, if not this story in particular. Let's keep going. His mother met them at the stairs, her hair still tied up in a scarf. She ran a hand through his hair and then began rubbing his back. "Is he all right?" she said quietly. "It's his arm," his father said as they began up the stairs. "It might be broken or it might just be sprained. I'll take him for x-rays later either way. I'm more worried about the fact that he hasn't said a word since I pulled him out of the well." "What's wrong, honey?" she whispered as she took him by the hand. He answered with a sigh. She stroked his hair again. He felt his father peck him on the temple. Oh. Nice of Martha to have 2 lines. Good God. I always remember that in the movie, Martha literally, I think, has maybe 1 line and then she screams and then she dies. And here she has multiple lines. So that's always fun. They took him to the master bedroom and sat him down on the bed as his father stepped out to get his medical supplies. The sun illuminated the gold accents on the dark walls and the elaborate embroidery on the duvet. He wanted badly to crawl under those covers and curl into a ball, but it wasn't worth the pain. He cursed his arm for keeping him from feeling comfortable and safe. He drifted off to sleep before his father returned and awoke to find his arm in a sling and his mother on the bed beside him. Alfred came in and set a large vase of roses on the mantelpiece. "Took quite a spell, didn't you?" she asked as she rubbed his stomach. "And you know why we fall? So we can learn to pick ourselves back up." Bruce finally managed to smile. So let me pause here because the whole like Martha has a line thing. With Martha, I did give her this significant line because it bothered me. Not just that Martha kind of had no lines and then died, despite the fact that like a symbol of her does become important in The Dark Knight Rises. It felt kind of empty because she barely existed as a character. But what really bothered me is the way that the movie, particularly this movie, hyper-focused on Bruce's relationship with his father at the expense of his relationship with his mom, as if, like, her impact on him did not matter, and I didn't like that. I still don't like it. So I do really appreciate Past Me for trying to do something about that and change it so that instead Martha also contributes like important symbols to the story and has an impact on the character. There's more elements that kind of play into this because it just feels weird to me that it's like the legacy of Thomas Wayne is the one, and I understand because Martha like married into the family, but that's still his fucking mom. It's just, it does not sit right with me. And I'm super glad that I changed that. But let's keep going. The nightmares began immediately. He could still see the wings thrashing in the dark whenever he closed his eyes. Their screeches sounded in his ears every night. More than once he'd find his mother or father at the door asking if he was all right. Occasionally he braved the dark, cavernous halls to slip into their bed in the hopes that it would help. It didn't always. It was no surprise when he woke to see his father that morning, sometime after he'd gotten the sling taken off. "The bats again?" he asked quietly. Bruce nodded, and Thomas came and sat on the edge of the bed. "You know why they attacked you, right?" Bruce cocked his head to the side. "You scared them." His father laughed at the look of surprise on his face. "You're a lot bigger than a bat, aren't you?" Bruce shrugged. "All creatures feel fear." "Even the scary ones?" Bruce asked with a small smile. "Especially the scary ones." He motioned for Bruce to follow him. "Let me show you something." He took Bruce by the hand and led him down the hall towards the master bedroom. Out of the window, the sky was starting to tint orange with the morning sun. Thomas opened the door quietly, put a finger to his lips, then pointed to his mother sleeping on the bed. Silently, they moved to her jewelry box next to the fireplace. He opened the side where his mother kept her pearls. A new strand was there, yellow-green against the many strands of white. He let out a small gasp. They were absolutely beautiful. "They're beautiful." "Don't tell your mom, okay?" his father whispered. Bruce grinned up at him. "I promise." He decided to climb into his parents' bed instead of returning to his own room. He snuggled down between them under the linen sheets and silken duvet, feeling much better and much safer. He could have sworn he heard his mother whisper the words "thank you" as he drifted off to sleep. That was nice. One thing I will say is that I always feel a little weird about like them talking about like, "Oh, the bats are scared of you," and that, and then he goes, "Let me show you something," and then goes show him the necklace, and it's like, what do these two things have to do with each other? I feel like if we had switched around a few things and just had it like, "Do you want to come sleep in our room?" "Yeah, sure. While you're in here, let me show you this thing I got your mom winged." Like, I feel like that would have worked better and made a little more sense. But let's keep going. The light of sunset bounced off of the panes of the skyscrapers and cast the entire monorail car in a deep gold the next evening. The car buzzed with the chatter of other people. Bruce looked out to the city zooming by, a blur of bleep blop bloop. Bruce looked out to the city zooming by, a blur of brick and glass and steel, distorted by the water droplets on the glass surface. Just say the window. His parents were on the seat in front of him, dressed in their finery, his mother in a black satin gown and his father in a fine suit. Martha absently stroked the pearls around her neck. They were just the right color. They offset her olive-toned skin perfectly. You know what bothers me even more about that line where I repeated glass is that I didn't even use the word window before that. I thought I had, and I just missed it. Right after I said that, I'm like, I bet I used the word window, but then I look back, and I didn't. Anyway, let's keep going. Did you make this train, Dad? Bruce asked as he gazed out at the city, toying absently at the silk bow in his hair. His father nodded. Gotham's been good to our family, but now the city is suffering. People less fortunate than us are enduring hard times. He drew a circle in the condensation on the window, lines crossing each other to form spokes. So we built a new public transportation system to unite the city, and at the center, he tapped right in the middle of the wheel, then pointed to an old skyscraper outside of the window. Wayne Tower. Is that where you work? Bruce asked. He shook his head. No, I work at the hospital. I leave the running of our company to better men. Better? He asked, tilting his head. His father smiled. Well, more interested men. The Gotham City Opera House was the epitome of elegance. Glittering chandeliers hung from the gilded ceilings in a room covered in gold paint and burgundy velvet. People in expensive suits and sparkling gowns filled the theater, their attention focused on the stage. Figures danced in front of a stormy mountain scene, black costumes billowing in their wake. Others descended, flapping bony black wings. They're just actors, he reminded himself, but he couldn't shake the sickening feeling growing in his stomach. His pace began to quicken with the tempo of the music. He could almost hear the skeletal wings thrashing about him. The rising pitch of the strings turned to screeching in his ears, and he could have sworn the little red scratches on his arms were starting to ache. Ooh. He turned to his father desperately. Can we go? Thomas looked over his glasses at him. His mother had turned as well. He didn't want to cause a scene, so he tried to plead with his eyes. His father just nodded. The three of them rose an inch toward the end of the row. They exited out of a side door and emerged into a dark alleyway. Martha crouched down in front of him, eyes full of concern. What's wrong, Bruce? She raised a hand to his cheek. He looked down in shame. Thomas placed a hand on her back. He's fine. He had a furtive look in his eyes. I just needed a bit of air. A little opera goes a long way, right, Bruce? He winked. Bruce let out a small sigh of relief. Come on. Okay, so, just a note. I mean, I know that they probably didn't know that it would be that intense, but why would they take Bruce to see this? I always am like, why? Like, he's clearly been having nightmares about what happened. Like, he's clearly traumatized by what happened. So don't take him to, like, a, production that could possibly have anything that even looks like a bat. That just seems, like, unnecessarily, like, stressful for the kid. But, anyway. He led his family towards the warm glow of the street when a man darted out of the shadows. He was thin and ragged, barely able to keep his voice steady, and he had a gun. Wallet, jewelry, fast. His father's voice was calm. That's fine, just take it easy. He handed Bruce his jacket and then reached into his pocket and removed his wallet. Here you go. Thomas held it out to the man, but he was shaking so badly that he dropped it when he tried to grab it. He crouched down for it, with his eyes still trained on them. I said jewelry, he hissed through chattering teeth. Martha began removing her rings and bracelets. The man jerked the gun up at her neck. He wanted the pearls. Thomas stepped in front of her instinctively. Hey, just... He was cut off as a gunshot rung out across the brick walls. Martha's eyes widened in horror as Thomas crumpled to the ground in front of them, and she fell to her knees beside him with tears running down her face. Bruce was frozen in place, staring at his father on the ground as blood seeped from under his body. The man grabbed for the pearls around her neck, but she started to hit him before he could lay a hand on her. You bastard, she screamed. You stay away from my baby. She grabbed for Bruce, but another gunshot rang out. He looked in her eyes one last time as she slid to the ground. They stared back, cold, blank, and unfocused. Oh, God, that hurts. He took the necklace from her neck and retrieved the wallet, but stopped at the sound of sobbing. The sight of the boy crying into his father's shoulder with his hands smeared in red caused him to start shaking again. The pearls slipped from his quivering hands and he ran off, disappearing around a corner. The rest of the night was a whirlwind as the police descended on the scene and whisked him away to the police station. The place was buzzing with reporters when they arrived, and everyone's eyes were on him as they let him in. No one spoke. He ended up completely alone in the captain's office at one point, still trying to process the events he'd just witnessed. Is that your father's? He looked up to find a young cop staring back at him. His pale features were covered with lines that made him seem older than he really was. His blue eyes were weary from a long day at work, but friendly. He crouched down and reached for the jacket. Bruce gripped it tighter. He wasn't sure what to make of this stranger. "It's okay," he reassured him. Bruce let him take it then, and he draped it over his shoulders. Bruce felt better, like everything would be okay, if only for a moment. I don't know why the first two sentences in this are connected with a semicolon instead of just two sentences, but anyway. "Gordon!" They both jumped at a voice behind them. A tall black man, the police captain, was standing in the doorway. "You gotta stick your nose into everything." He pointed his thumb out of the door behind him. "Out of my sight." Gordon gave Bruce a short nod before he rose and left. Captain Loeb shook his head and crossed his arms as he watched him go. "Good news, son," the captain said to him. "We got him." He moved toward him and opened his fist to reveal Martha's necklace. "I thought you'd want these." Bruce took them in his own hands and stared at them absently. The funeral was later that week, on a day as gray as Bruce felt. He wore the same dress he'd had on that night, and the pearls too, after he'd convinced Alfred to let him have them. They buried his parents on the grounds between his grandparents and his uncle, in the side yard underneath the weeping cypress tree. The service was small and quiet, just the way they would have wanted. He didn't talk very much. Many people offered their condolences to him, family, friends, his father's co-workers, people who worked for the company, and he nodded and thanked them quietly. While he was with Alfred, a gray-haired man kneeled down beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. He knew of him. He was Mr. Earl, and he was in charge of Wayne Enterprises. He had met him when his father took him to the tower once. "You're in excellent hands, Bruce," he said, "and we're minding the Empire. When you're all grown up, it'll be waiting." Bruce didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to make of that just then. Every time I read that, I'm always like, is that what you really want to say to a kid who's just lost his parents? I'm pretty sure that's not what he's worried about right now. One of his father's friends came up after him. She was a younger woman with bright blue eyes and platinum blonde hair. "Hi, Bruce," she said to him quietly. "Hello." "How are you?" she asked. Her voice was almost a whisper. He took a breath. "I'm okay, I guess." "That's good. I just want you to know that if you need anything at all, you can ask me, all right?" He nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Evans." She put a hand on his shoulder. "You look just like him, you know," she said with a sad smile on her face. "Just like him, but you have her eyes." She had beautiful eyes. She touched his cheek gingerly before she rose again. And I like the compare and contrast there. It's like Mr. Earl is like, "We're minding the Empire," and then this woman actually offers help and says something really heartfelt. He hovered around his Aunt Wanda for most of the night. She was an old hand at these things. She'd lost many of her own family members, including her own husband, his father's twin brother. He still remembered when they would visit him at the hospital. Bruce had become increasingly apprehensive about them as his uncle's condition deteriorated. They were identical twins, and it was no stretch to imagine that it was his own father withering away in that hospital bed. She faced death with a bravery he would later wish he had because she had no choice. He sat with her on one of the sofas in the living room. The floor lamps cast the place into a golden light that reflected distantly in the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The many vases sat on the tables were filled with big white lilies. She still had her shawl wrapped around her sunburned arms, and her blonde hair had been loosed and tumbled down over her shoulder. His little cousin was asleep on his lap, his head rested against his chest. "It's been a long day," she said. Her voice was low. "Was it hard?" he asked quietly. "When Uncle Richard—" He still couldn't bring himself to say the word. "Yeah, it's always hard at first, baby," she said as she began to rub his back, "but it gets better." "It does?" "It always does. It might take a while." She closed her eyes for a moment and took a breath, "but it gets better, I promise." He sat there a bit longer, listening to the sound of the rain as it fell onto the roof. The pitter-patter of the raindrops actually worked to calm his nerves. After a moment, he felt his breathing fall into sync with his cousin's. He laid his chin against his head. Mikey was lucky to be just a baby, he thought. He was even smaller when his dad had passed, just barely out of the hospital. He didn't have to remember when he got older, and he still had a mom. "I think it's time for bed," she said. He sighed. "Okay." He wasn't too keen on facing his dreams that night. I usually take this time to explain the whole, Aunt Wanda thing, but suffice to say that this story was connected to a few other fanfics that I had back in the day. Mike is a character who would have showed up in my Inception fanfic. Wanda is just his mom. There's a long, convoluted story as to why Bruce's dad has a twin brother in this, but I don't feel like getting into it, because what I want to say is that scene was actually really good. I remember reading this once and saying that, this chapter increases in quality as it goes along, and I still agree with that. These scenes have been some of the best stuff that we've read so far. The writing quality itself isn't necessarily better. This feels really meaningful, you know? But let's keep going. She walked him to his room and helped him into his pajamas, then did the same with his cousin before lying him down on the bed. He was tired, but he didn't want to sleep yet, so he climbed onto his window seat and watched the people leave from the drive. He could feel the silence pressing on him from behind the sound of the rain. Rachel happened to spot him as she and her mother were leaving. She ducked from under the umbrella and waved. He hesitated, then returned it slowly. He rested his head on his knees and let out a sigh. He felt so tired. He'd never been more tired in his life. The bright lights outside became distorted as the rain became heavier. Or was it his eyelids? He didn't lift his head when he heard the door open behind him, or when Alfred said he'd made dinner, or even when he left. "Is it my fault?" he suddenly said. "Master Bruce," Alfred said. "I asked them to leave the theater," he said absently. "If I hadn't, it would have been someone else," Wanda finished. "I did not know she was still in the room." He didn't move when he felt a hand on his back. "I hate to say it like that, but it's true. Nothing you did can excuse that man," Alfred told him. Bruce didn't respond. "I think you should get in the bed now, honey," she said, "unless you're hungry." Bruce rose from his place and crawled under the covers. Bruce laid there for a few hours after that, staring toward his window from his pillow. It must have been about midnight once he finally felt the tears. He sat up and pulled his knees to his chest again, but to bury his face this time. It was like it hit him all at once, and suddenly his whole body was racked with sobs. He didn't start to pull himself together until he heard Mikey stir beside him. He wiped away the rest of his tears with the back of his hand. He didn't want Mikey to see him cry. It just upset him. Eventually, he lay back down and pulled the covers up to his chest. That was the first night he didn't have the nightmare. He didn't dream at all that night. His mind was blank, black as a void. And that is the end of that chapter. The back half of that, particularly the stuff from the funeral, is some of the best stuff that I have read in this. I think what it is that that chapter was actually, like, emotionally affecting. It was decent, and particularly, like, I think I would say from the part where Bruce's parents die all the way up to the end of the chapter is pretty decent. The first part of the chapter definitely had some shit that bothered me, though, but once we got past, like, the opera, it actually started to get really good. So overall, I would say this chapter was actually pretty fucking decent, for once. Thank God. I don't know if this is necessarily true, but I have noticed that throughout a lot of my works so far, original content tends to be better than stuff that I copy from the source material. Batman Begins is an interesting situation, though, because I didn't watch the movie at all while I wrote this. I wrote it based entirely off of the script. So a lot of this is me paraphrasing and making up my own shit, but I think it still kind of stands that the parts that are not based off of anything in the movie, which is most of what happens at the funeral between the very beginning of it and the very end parts, is pretty good, you know? But again, the parent death scene was actually pretty good as well, especially Martha's death. That really got to me. Overall, the story's off to an okay start. I have hopes. I don't want to say high hopes because I have read this story before. It was not even a year ago. But I am hoping that I at least am able to stay engaged and I find some nice stuff that I enjoy in this. So I'm looking forward to the next 3 chapters. So if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I will see you for the next episode. Bye.